What's up, and welcome to Chapter 30 of AMSCO U.S. History, Conservative Resurgence from 1980 to 2000. Please make sure to support me by subscribing and also sharing these videos with your friends. Thanks so much. Moral decay was a weekly theme of religious leaders in this era of conservative religious revival. These people, known as televangelists, used the medium of television to promote their ideals. Religion also started to play a much bigger role in electoral politics when an evangelist from Virginia named Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority. This organization financed campaigns to unseat the more liberal members of Congress. These religious fundamentalists also attacked secular humanism, basically people who were not adhering to Christian principles, and they accused these people of taking over public education. They also campaigned for the return of prayers and teaching of biblical creation stories, so not like the Scopes trial seen in Tennessee. They also wanted to have a right-to-life movement. They were against Roe v. Wade and abortion in the United States, which was legalized in 1973, and this movement united Catholics and fundamental Protestants because they all believed that human life begins at the moment of conception. Ronald Reagan defeated the incumbent Jimmy Carter in the election of 1980, and his administration advocated for supply-side economics, which included tax cuts and reduced government spending. This hoped to increase investment by the private sector, and it also hoped to lead to an increased amount of production, jobs, and prosperity in the United States. This directly contrasted with Keynesian economics, which was practiced by the Democrats. Many critics of this supply-side theory didn't like it, and they called it the trickle-down economics, kind of like the ones that existed in the 1920s, where the wealthy Americans prospered, and some of their increased spending would eventually benefit the people below them, that is, the middle class and the poor. The Reagan administration also spent billions of dollars to build new weapon systems, such as the B-1 bomber seen here and the MX missile, and he also wanted to expand the U.S. Navy. This increased spending was known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. It was an ambitious plan for building a high-tech system of lasers and particle beams that would scientifically, supposedly, destroy enemy missiles if they ever tried to reach U.S. territory. This is kind of like a Star Wars. Critics called it that, and they argued that the costly program would escalate the arms race with the Soviets, and if the Soviets built enough missiles, they could break down the system. Congress didn't like many of Reagan's proposals, but nonetheless, the defense budget grew crazily. It doubled. The Reagan administration also tried to fight far-left groups such as socialists and communists. They tried to aid the Nicaraguan Contras, who were against socialism in their country, but this involved a serious scandal. It involved the Iran-Contra Affair. Since 1980, Iran and Iraq had been in a very bloody war, and the Reagan aides decided to come up with a plan that they kept secret from the American public. This included selling U.S. anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles to Iran's government, and in return, Iran would hope to free Americans who were held hostage by a radical Arab group in Iran. The government used the profits of these arms deals with Iran to fund these Contras in Nicaragua and give them money to continue to fight the socialists over there. Reagan declined and denied that he had any knowledge of this illegal diversion of funds. It was illegal because it violated congressional budget authority. This showed, however, that his administration was uninformed and he was a hands-off president who was easily manipulated by his advisors at times. This caused a sharp but ultimately temporary drop in his popularity polls. Overall, he was still very popular. In the early 80s, the Cold War really intensified because Reagan started to put up more arms, and the Soviets also put more arms up against NATO countries. But in 1985, a dynamic Soviet reformer named Mikhail Gorbachev became the new Soviet leader, and he wanted to change Soviet domestic politics. He had two major reforms. First was Glasnost, or openness. It was to end the political repression and move toward greater political freedom for Soviet citizens. Communism really didn't allow this at the time. Also, Perestroika. It was a restructuring of the Soviet economy to achieve some free market practices and be like Western country capitalism. And to achieve this reform, he had to end the costly arms race and also to create a deal to help the Soviet economy. In 1987, Reagan challenged the Soviet leader to follow through with his reforms at Brandenburg Gate and the Berlin Wall over in West Germany. This was, of course, a divisive symbol of the Cold War, and in this speech he famously said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," and soon the wall came down. To ease tensions, the two leaders also agreed to remove and destroy all intermediate-range missiles, known in part as the INF Agreement. Gorbachev also agreed to reduce Cold War tensions by starting the pullout of Soviet troops from Afghanistan. The Soviets had actually put troops into Afghanistan when the country was in war. Gorbachev also decided to cooperate with the United States and put diplomatic pressure on Iran and Iraq to end their war because it was causing destability in the Middle East. And by the end of Reagan's second term, these superpower relations had improved so much that the Cold War seemed to be ending soon. Medically, HIV and AIDS ran really rampant during this time of the Reagan administration because this administration was conservative and it didn't necessarily want to control this. HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus, and it causes acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, known as AIDS. It was caused in big part because of the gay rights movement and sexual permissiveness from all sorts of people, where sex outside of marriage was becoming more prominent and people were not taking good care of their bodies, and also increased drug use that was sharing needles and spreading disease. Originally, it was called the Gay-Related Immunodeficiency Syndrome, so it was called GRIDS, but eventually people realized that you didn't have to be gay to get AIDS, and so it changed its name to AIDS. STDs were really rampant during the 80s, but throughout this, new drugs were able to be created to try to combat this illness. In 1988, a new president came, George H.W. Bush, and he had hopes for a new world order of peace and democracy. But it was challenged in August of 1990 when Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein invaded neighboring country of Kuwait, which was really oil-rich but also small and quite weak. This threatened Western oil sources, of course, in Saudi Arabia and the whole Persian Gulf. And so many American allies, including America, were not too happy about this. As a result, America helped to build a coalition of UN members to put pressure on Hussein to draw out of Kuwait. But of course, Saddam did not listen. Thus, a UN embargo went into Iraq, but ultimately it didn't have much effect. Congress then approved a military campaign to roll back this aggression, and in January of 1991, a big operation called Operation Desert Storm started. More than 500,000 Americans and military units from 28 other nations started 5 weeks of airstrikes and then an on-ground invasion. But only 100 hours after the fighting on the ground, Iraq decided to surrender. Some Americans were disappointed that the U.S. didn't go into Iraq and remove Hussein, but nonetheless, Bush enjoyed a really high boost in his approval rating to nearly 90%. In 1992, however, the economy took a turn for the worse, and many Americans wanted a new leader. And among Democrats, Bill Clinton was the youthful governor of Arkansas, and he really emerged from the primaries to take the Democratic nomination. He was the first member of the baby boom population to be nominated for president, and he was articulate and energetic. He was a moderate new Democrat, so it wasn't much like the liberalization of the older Democrats, and he focused on economic issues primarily to balance the federal budget. He also tried to improve jobs, education, and healthcare for all Americans, which he thought was very helpful for the vital electorate, which were the people in America who were primarily voting for him. During President Clinton's 2 terms, the U.S. enjoyed the longest peacetime economic expansion in its history, with growth rates greater than 4%. There was a lot of technological innovations at this time. These included personal computers, software, internet, cable, and other wireless communications. This helped to increase national productivity. A dot-com boom also emerged during this time. Electronic commerce started to grow rapidly, and it soon became a big part of American life. We see this with like Amazon today. High-tech companies such as Apple, Intel, Microsoft, Amazon, AOL, Yahoo, and Google also started during this time, so these companies are still fairly young. They faced heavy competition with Europe and Asia, these American businesses did, but they soon became proficient in cutting costs with the help of the computer, and this helped them to increase profitability and also help the American economy keep inflation low. Stock grew a lot during this time, households also expanded, and unemployment went down. During the peak of this prosperity, average and lower income Americans also experienced the first gains in real income, so no inflation since 1973. This was really great for Americans, and this economic boom, however, was over by 2001 when investors and wage earners faced another recession. This was the dot-com failure during this time. Clinton also helped trade by signing the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. It created a free trade zone with Canada and Mexico, the North American countries. It was Republican-backed, so many people approved of it, and it helped to promote trade between North America, but it also outsourced cheap jobs to Mexico, such as the auto industry. Since Trump has taken office, however, it has been replaced with the USMCA, United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which has renegotiated NAFTA. Republicans took over the midterm elections of November 1994, just 2 years after Clinton took over office, and this was the first time they controlled both houses of Congress since 1954. They promoted a well-organized effort to promote a short list of policies benefiting America. This was known as the Contract with America. It was like 10 bullet points of things they really needed to get done. The Democratic Congress was unpopular because years before it had raised taxes and limited gun ownership. Americans didn't like that. Clinton adjusted to this new Republican resurgence by saying the era of big government is over, and soon smaller government started to take control. The leader who came out of this was Newt Gingrich. He was the new House Majority Leader, and with other Republicans, they really started to promote this. In the election year of 1996, Congress and the President compromised on a budget that left Medicare and Social Security benefits intact. This helped to benefit many Americans. Clinton also sided with Republicans on many issues, and one of these was limited welfare benefits to 5 years. This was signed under the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. It was a big welfare reform movement, and it's called the PRWOA. Other things that Clinton hoped to put into practice were some curbs on immigrants, also increasing the minimum wage, and also balancing the budget, which went extremely out of whack during the Reagan administration. He hoped to reduce the deficit and also had surplus in some years. He took popular positions such as balancing this budget and reforming welfare to gain bigger proportions of the vote. He was also helped by this fast-growing economy brought by the internet. Ultimately, all these surging increases in trade with new trade deals and the internet, communications, and the movement of capital around the world promoted a new era, the era of globalization. This promoted the development of global and regional economic organizations. The World Trade Organization was formed to help with trade agreements, enforce trade rules, and settle disputes. New banks such as the International Monetary Fund and World Bank also helped to loan money to poor nations with lots of debt. A Group of 8 G8 summit started with the largest industrial powers. These powers controlled 2/3 of the world's wealth, and they continued to become the leading economic powers into the 21st century. New countries such as China, India, and Brazil would soon surpass many of these countries too, and eventually they would grow into big industrial powers as well. Globalization, however, contributed to a growing gap between the rich and poor nations of the world caused by tensions and debts, and many of these poor nations owed lots of money to these powerful banks and rich nations. Workers and unions also suffered, and they didn't like globalization because, such as what NAFTA showed, America had outsourced a lot of jobs, such as from the auto industry, to cheaper markets such as Mexico in the developing world. This has been Chapter 30, A Resurgence in Conservatism in America, from 1980 to 2000. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.